There was little question that I was a huge Jurassic Park fan when it first came out. Not only did the movie bring to life just about every dinosaur fantasy I'd had since I was a kid, but it also opened the floodgates for Jurassic Park video games to come out on basically every single console that was available at the time. I was totally okay with this and was itching to see what they could make on the Super NES, which was my console of choice. Though I was more than aware even then that movies turned into video games were usually terrible, I still had my hopes up for Jurassic Park. I mean, how hard could it be to truly fuck up a video game about shooting rampaging dinosaurs? Thankfully, the game ended up being pretty great, even if it wasn't at all what anyone was actually expecting it to be. Jurassic Park on the Super NES decided not to go for the obvious side-scrolling action game that everyone on Earth was doing on the other consoles, and instead opted for an overhead Zelda-like adventure game. That was actually pretty shocking to see the first time you loaded up the game. Instead of running and gunning through hordes of dinosaurs, this was a slower, more plotting game, filled with exploration and puzzles and dungeons. While the initial shock of the game not being an action game kinda put me off at first, it didn't take long for me to really warm up to the game. Essentially, things boil down to you trying to escape the park by navigating your way around the island. You start off near the power generator, go through the visitor center, around the shore, and finally back to the helipad where you eventually make your escape. There's a fair bit of backtracking around the island to finish the various side objectives, but the island itself isn't super big, so it never got too boring. Probably the biggest problem with getting around the island is getting lost, especially if it's your first time playing the game. A lot of the island can be very maze-like, and if you don't know the exact route, you'll probably hit a dead end full of raptors. There's also no in-game island map, so you better get out the graph paper for this one if you want to make your own. Once you figure out your way through though, you can breeze through the overhead map and get to the dungeons in no time, which is where the game takes a dramatic turn in just about every single way. As soon as you enter a dungeon, which is like the power shed or the visitor center, the game went into a full-on first-person shooter mode. Now keep in mind this was at a time where anything that even resembled 3D on a home console was considered nothing short of a miracle. So it was pretty amazing the first time you walk into a building and the perspective changes to you staring down a raptor. Of course that raptor was the crudest 2D bitmap you've ever seen in a video game, but it didn't matter. It was really awesome, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't fall back out of my chair the first time one of them actually lunged at me. But once you got over the initial shock of the view change, you realized pretty quickly you'd probably rather go back to playing the overhead view instead. Moving in these areas was like trying to guide a semi-truck through a hallway, and trying to shoot the dinosaurs in them was even worse due to just how slow it was to line up your shot. Thankfully, the developers seemed to recognize this since these areas are all pretty easy. The dinosaurs in them just kinda stand in place and watch, patiently waiting for you to blow them apart as soon as you could finally line up a shot to do so. And pretty much all the dungeons themselves just kind of boil down to finding a keycard to open a new area so you can continue on. Some of these areas could be a bit long, but overall it was such a neat gimmick that, well, I just really didn't care at the time. The only real issue with Jurassic Park is that there's no save feature at all. No battery backup or even a password feature is present in this one. That meant you had to beat the entire game in one sitting on a few lives and a couple of continues. This was absolutely brutal, as the game can eventually get pretty tough. Also, it's not a short game at all. It could take 3 to 4 hours to complete even if you know exactly where to go and what to do. I never managed to beat the game as a kid, and I always blamed not having a save feature because of it. I actually still do, since I would love to play through the entire thing finally, but I just don't have the patience these days to do so in one giant playthrough. Yes, I know about save states and emulators, but I'd rather play through it as intended on the actual Super NES. Overall though, Jurassic Park on the Super NES was a really cool game. The overhead stuff worked great and had just enough action and exploration to keep you interested. And the first person stuff, while clumsy, was totally playable and atmospheric for the time. If you never checked out Jurassic Park on the Super NES or was put off by the fact that it wasn't a run and gun shooter, I still think it's worth looking into if you're a Jurassic Park fan at all. Even if you don't feel like playing through the entire game at once, it's still a fun little game while it can keep your attention. I'd still highly recommend checking it out even today because it's a really fun game, especially for a Jurassic Park game.